Now it is my great pleasure to welcome Corey Hutchins to the podcast. Corey oversees the Journalism Institute at Colorado College, advises the Colorado Media Project, and serves on the board of the state chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Each Friday, he publishes Inside the News in Colorado that reports on, comments on, and analyzes the goings-on in Colorado's media scene, connecting local developments to what's happening nationally and exploring what makes the state's local news ecosystem so unique. He also oversees the database of the Colorado News Mapping Project that seeks to identify where Coloradans are getting their local news and information in each county. Corey, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Do you read the newsletter?
I do, absolutely.
What do you think?
I try not to get too sad about it lately.
Somebody once described it. I think Mark described it as, he's the 9 News anchor, years ago described it as like reading a crime blotter for journalism. That's not the intent. The point is to highlight when things are going well in our state's news scene. And of course, sometimes, because it's the nature of the news business economically these days, you're probably sad because I'm writing about layoffs or another news organization going
closing, yeah, that kind of thing.
I had to break some news for you. A newsletter's not out till tomorrow, but I've got another newspaper closure.
Oh no!
In this week's newsletter out in Eagle County, a weekly newspaper that's been around since like 1901 or something, and we're just seeing this happen like every month, it seems.
Well, let's talk about that. Are there some commonalities that you're seeing as to why these papers are closing, or are the situations always different? What's the thread that links everything?
If I had to say, I mean, it sounds intuitive, but I mean, it's the digital age. But what always gets me is like, it's been the digital age for a while.
Right.
So why now?
Right.
I have heard, and like, okay, if you were a newspaper, let's say in a rural community and you survived the height of the pandemic lockdowns when the business closures were happening and you were losing advertisers and stuff like that, like why didn't you survive that, but then a few years later closed? And so when a newspaper does close, we try, I ask, and if they usually say it in their announcements. And you asked about a commonality, like one is it's advertising, just the advertising, the traditional model the newspapers relied on, the bottom fell out of that kind of a long time ago. And I think now it's just finally caught up to where it's not viable for these publications. And I think it's hand in hand with changing habits of readers. And what I have heard from multiple publications, it seems like over the past year at least, is that you'll hear that a news organization that closed will say something like their advertisers feel like they can post things for free on sites like Facebook, or get better ROI on their targeted Facebook ads by putting their ads there instead of the newspaper where they did it for a long time. I mean, anybody who's ever used Facebook Marketplace knows how easy it is to sell something. And so that's certainly one commonality. And I think that, paper to paper, it's kind of different about when it comes to the relationship they have with their community. One newspaper that said it was going to close by the start of this year made that announcement, I think, in the summer. And then their readership kind of learned that was the case and rallied around it. This was in Baca County, the state's most southeastern county, right? The Eastern County Plainsman, or the Plainsman Herald, sorry. The readers learned that it was in dire straits and said, what can we do to help? And that paper is kind of still hanging on. So
are these papers still printing actual?
It's not funny.
Are they still printing actual papers in most of the cases here?
Sure. Yeah. So like the smaller kind of weekly papers that have been around for like 100 years or so, those papers did get in some trouble when Gannett, which is the nation's largest newspaper chain, just mothballed, abruptly canceled their printing press down in Pueblo, throwing some 70 or more newspapers into an absolute tailspin, had to scramble for a new printer, and there's not a lot left. These are going extinct. I took a class of mine to a printing press a few years. Actually, it was the Pueblo Chieftains printing press a few years ago. And I made this offhand comment, maybe on the bus back or something, where I said, I remember going to see the woolly mammoth exhibit at the Natural History Museum when I was in school. And I feel like that's what you looked at when you looked at that printing press. I didn't think it would go extinct so quick. It was only a few years later that they got rid of it. And that made newspapers have to look to Kansas and New Mexico and Wyoming and go out of state. And then so they are printing, and the papers that still print say that their community wants it. And some of them don't want to go digital. That's not for them. And we did see a bit of a man bites dog story here in Colorado that I don't know if happened anywhere else lately, but a nonprofit that runs Colorado Community Media, that string of 24 newspapers in Denver suburbs, that nonprofit, the National Trust for Local News, just bought a used printing press from Canada, I think, and then transported it to Denver and just got that thing up and running. And so while we're seeing presses disappear, we're also seeing what they call mission driven, a nonprofit press coming in to kind of see what they can do to help and offer lower rates and really have a community asset component to it and not just a profit driven thing. I was just going to say, what I always say about Colorado, it's the best of times and worst of times. We have a lot of the ills that kind of afflict the local news business, whether it's newspapers or public radio or anything nationally, are kind of exacerbated here in Colorado. But at the same time, a lot of the innovations to try and mitigate the local news crisis in this country kind of seem to take root in Colorado as well, which is pretty interesting. And that's why I always have something to write about every week.
Well, I want to get back to that in a minute, but first, you've been a reporter for a long time, writing for national and local news outlets. How did you end up in the media, covering the media?
Yeah, I started out as a local reporter, and I covered politics in South Carolina. I was at a weekly newspaper called The Free Times, and I was their political reporter. There's not a better state in the country to get a start covering politics than South Carolina, because it's just so offbeat and weird and just straight up fun. And Columbia Journalism Review had put a call out. They wanted to hire a correspondent to cover a few states in the Southeast. They wanted somebody to cover North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia, and just cover what was going on in the local media scene. And alt weekly newspapers have always had a tradition of kind of being the kind of counterculture, funky, punky newspaper that's kind of taking digs at the local daily, and being the watchdog on kind of the traditional media in a city. And so I kind of felt like I was doing that at the Alternative Weekly as a political reporter. And I saw that CJR had this position, but South Carolina wasn't in it. And I wrote them and said, whoever gets this job, you should really consider putting South Carolina in the mix. And then I gave a whole bunch of reasons, like a manifesto of what I thought was going on, what the problems were with the media in South Carolina. I think
they said, why don't you do it?
They said, if we put South Carolina in there, will you apply? And so I became the correspondent for Columbia Journalism Review, covering South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. And I came out to Colorado 10 years ago now, and I became the Rocky Mountain correspondent for Columbia Journalism Review. So I covered a bunch of the Rocky Mountain states, and then got a job at the Colorado, covering politics for Colorado Independent. That's probably where we might have crossed paths.
Yes, I was gonna mention that. Yeah.
And so that's how. So I wrote for Columbia Journalism Review, covering the local media scene for nearly a decade. And within the past few, and I started my newsletter for them. And in the past few years, I just decided to do my own thing and move it to Substack and just cover Colorado. And when I did that, I wondered if I could do this every week. And now I think I could do it twice a week. There's just so much happening.
Wow. That's and this is all, you said you sell some advertising. Is it underwritten? Is there a model that you're following that works for this?
I think it's a model that we're going to see more journalists adopt. I think what we're seeing is the kind of a fragmentation, decentralization. You're seeing journalists leave large legacy news organizations. Like, you think, right, you're a journalist, and you might think getting to the New York Times is like the pinnacle of your journalism career.
Right. It used to be that way. Sure.
And now you're seeing our Washington Post, the big legacy brands, and now you're seeing people who have been there for a few years and are still like relatively young are leaving and creating, or they've already built their audience there maybe, and then have like moved their audience over to their own thing. And I feel like we see that happen. That's been happening now for several years. And it's like every week, another journalist leaves a major legacy news organization and starts their own Substack newsletter or their own podcast. And so you asked me about like the economics of it. Mine is so I have a full-time job, right? I run the Journalism Institute at Colorado College. So inside the news in Colorado, it's kind of weird. Like I almost just said like it's a side thing, but it's not, because everything I do is so kind of related. I teach a class called the Future and Sustainability of Local News that like partners with Colorado Media Project and partners with Collab, the Colorado News Collaborative, and the Colorado Media Project underwrites my newsletter. And what that basically means is, and I'm also an advisor to them, so I do research for them and analysis for them. Like they want to know how many newspapers closed in the past 50 years. Me and like researcher David Copini at the University of Denver will like put together that report and then present it at a conference or something. So the Colorado Media Project underwrites the newsletter. Basically what that means is like, we like what you're doing. We want you to be able to keep doing it.
Right.
So we're going to support you to do that. And I also, Grasslands is another one, the Denver marketing firm. AAA Colorado was a sponsor. Oh. Colorado Health Foundation's been a sponsor. Colorado Press Association is currently running an ad campaign in the newsletter. And so you kind of have to you get to be the publisher, the editor, and also the person trying to make the economics work. And that's just kind of the new world in entrepreneurial journalism. And I've chosen a niche, local news in Colorado. Like, how many people care about that? Here's a question for you. I wonder I wonder how many subscribers you think I have.
I would guess 5,000.
5,000. So I'm getting there. Like, I'm going to hit that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, I appreciate it. And do you think that's good? To what extent do you think that's a decent following for a newsletter like this?
I don't know. I
don't either.
I started Colorado Polls in 2004.
And nice website, by the way. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And it's still 20 years later. I'm still like, is this? I know what our traffic is, but it's like, is it good? I don't know. I don't know how to compare it. I don't know what to put it next to. And in your case with the newsletter, I imagine you have the same issue.
Yeah. So I teach a class actually called Inbox Journalism, Writing for Newsletters at Colorado College, where I teach students to basically do what I do and do what this kind of like new breed of newsletter journalists do. And we're seeing something that I've identified as like the rise of the one-person newsroom, even here in Colorado, where like those folks who are leaving the big brands are starting their own thing. We're seeing local journalists leave the local newspaper, whether it be in Boulder or like Steamboat Springs, or Greeley, and start their own newsletter because they know the area, they know the people know them, they have their audience, and they're trying to make a go of it. And I'm trying to kind of track that trend and see what works and what doesn't. I wrote a big story recently about these indie journalists in the state who are doing these kind of things. And one thing I found that was interesting is they're still partnering with the local legacy mainstream media organizations in their network, in their area, because they kind of see themselves as like beyond competition. Like, we're here to serve our audience. And if my piece that I did, on my own for my own newsletter or website, like, I want more people to read that because it can have impact in the community. So yeah, exactly. Publish it in your paper. And then you see some of the kind of more, I keep using the term legacy organizations, are like, some of them are still in that kind of competitive model and might not want to do that. But I'm seeing that kind of competitive wall break down across Colorado. I've seen it crumble for the past decade. And I think now we are a real pioneer in this state of collaboration. And you just see way more news organizations willing to work together. I would call it the new orthodoxy in Colorado journalism is like this getting beyond this old story that we used to hear about. You probably remember the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post when they were just fierce competitors.
Made such a difference in this city.
Did it really? Like, the competition made better journalism, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so the Rocky closed in 2009, leaving the Denver Post. Denver Post now has 60 to 70 reporters, and that would be they had 300 back then. Right. Rocky had 300. So they had like 600 reporters crawling all over the city. But now the kind of competition has become collaboration. And it's just a new trend in local journalism that I think is now kind of, kind of started here, and people are in other states are looking at us and kind of adopting it elsewhere.
Wait, it strikes me as I'm listening to you talk that what initially seems like a bad thing that you're hearing about layoffs, reporters leaving outlets, but maybe it's not bad. Maybe it's just change, and the media journalism is finding a new way to reinvent itself.
It's an interesting way to look at it, because if you remember back in 2018, and you ever think about life like if it just went a different way and went on a different track, like what it would look like now if something been 4 or 5 years. So like think about what happened in 2018. There's like TV shows about this, right? That they call it the timeline. Like if you're in the dark timeline or you're in the whatever timeline, what would have happened in 2018 if the Denver Post which has a hedge fund owner, did not lay off 30 employees, which was like a third of its work, its newsroom or something like that, and really galvanize the community. I mean, it was on the front page of the New York Times, right? When that happened, and those 10 reporters left at a protest and they started the Colorado Sun. And because of the trauma that the hedge fund inflicted on the journalism scene in Colorado, an organization like Colorado Media Project started raising money to help mitigate the local news crisis in our state, and then helped form Collab, the Colorado News Collaborative, that fostered all this collaboration and stuff. Does that not happen at all if in 2018 the hedge fund doesn't do anything and it's just business as usual between 2018 and 2025? Like, what would our state's news scene look like now?
That's an interesting point.
Better or worse? And so I don't want to be the one sitting here being like, it was a good thing that nasty got its claws into the Denver Post, laid off those 30 people. But what happened afterwards is definitely so radical and different than what was happening up until then, that without that catalyst, I don't know what it would look like.
You mentioned the Colorado Sun. Every year you write the News Year in Review for the Sun. In a nutshell, what was your main takeaway from 2024?
Every year I try to come up with a theme, and 2020 was just total chaos. It was like how news organizations were operating after a global pandemic and everything that did to the news industry. The next year, I can't remember what the theme was. Oh, I think it was like for-profit newspapers converting to nonprofits. That became a theme. I might be mixing up some of the years here, but here are the few themes across the 5 years that I've done it for the Sun. Another year was the year that destroyed. Okay, maybe there was like a bounce back year. It was like, how are news organizations like reimagining themselves in a world where they've never had to ask their readers for money before, and that their advertisers are gone. They have to go straight to their readers for money. And so another theme was the year that broke the printing industry in Colorado. The Pueblo Chieftain, as I told you, they got rid of their newspaper, their newsprint plant. And then that happened again. The newspaper plant in Grand Junction actually went out of business even before that. And then just recently one in Loveland, owned by that hedge fund, disappeared. And so that was like the year that broke the printing industry. What was this year? Forgive me.
I did read it, but I'm leaving it to you to summarize it, because it was a lot.
The theme that I came up with this year was the sad fact that rural newsrooms closed, it seemed, at a greater clip. A national study showed that over the past 12, 13, 14, 15 months, nationally, newspapers were disappearing in communities as a rate of 2.5 per week. And last year in Colorado, I think they just hit the gas on that. We saw 5 newspapers in the rural Eastern Plains blink out. 2 of them came back, which is interesting. Nice success story there. We'll see how long that lasts. And radio stations too. It wasn't just local newspapers this time. We saw some layoffs at Colorado Public Radio. They laid off their virtually, I believe, their whole podcasting unit. And so that was a big deal, because Colorado Public Radio had been, and still I think is, a bright spot in the local media news.
Oh, definitely.
Where they were expanding. They were like one of the few that was just putting bureaus out on the Western Slope, hiring people all the time. And then they're just having trouble like public media is, whether it's on TV or on the radio all across the country, and having I think problems raising money. So they had to lay off 15 people. And then some other radio stations, like right as the lid was closing on 2024, I was like finishing up the column, and I saw a piece out of Southern Colorado that like two really long-standing news and music radio stations in Florence and that area, Canyon City area, blinked off the air. So not a very positive development and trend for 2024. And, we're 1 month now into 2025, and I can't tell you what it's going to look like 11 months from now, but under, what will the new White House and the new Trump administration mean for local news in Colorado? I mean, what might his administration do to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? And there's a lot of small rural public radio stations and non-rural public radio stations in Colorado that rely on CPB funding. Are they, they feel like they're on the chopping block right now?
The FCC chairman just today said that they're going to question PBS and I forget who else over whether or not they should be doing underwriting advertising while also receiving public money.
Well, I think not in the broadcast industry, but I would imagine if those organizations had to decide between underwriting and just not getting public support, I don't think they get a significant, they would say they need it, so it's significant, but it's not a major part of their budget.
Which one is not?
Public funding.
The public, okay.
I think they get the majority of their financial support from people.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that if the government were to somehow pull their funding, it doesn't mean the death of them necessarily.
It would mean retrenchment. They would have to make tough decisions for sure. And I wonder if they're bracing for that and thinking about how they would deal with it.
Let me ask you about political news coverage in 2024. How do you think Colorado's media did in terms of the way it covered the election?
So we as in the Colorado broadly media scene did something unprecedented in 2024. Because this collaborative spirit that I talked about earlier, news organizations talk to each other and they're on like big Slack channel together and they meet on Zoom calls and stuff, and they decide how they're going to partner on projects and things like that. So I don't remember how many, but a dozen or more, maybe 24, got together and decided that they wanted to cover politics in a different way, and agreed and acknowledged that the kind of lazy, usual, one might say traditional kind of horse race coverage and process story coverage, they were going to cast that aside. And they were going to cover the 2024 election in a way that was voter-centric, with the voters at the core, and always thinking about the voters when it came to their coverage. And so we had some news organizations like Colorado Newsline that wrote a headline. I'm going to mangle it, but it was something to the effect of, why we're abandoning horse race coverage. And, the Colorado Sun was part of that. And then you had like smaller news organizations and like upstart nonprofit news sites in communities. And they put out a survey that they called Voter Voices. And the project was called Voter Voices. And it was to try and make sure that they were centering their coverage around the issues that people wanted. I think, and like, I can say this because like I'm the person who I think is in the position to like judge how it went. I find it hard to tell.
Yeah.
I think the effort is laudable, because I, like you complain about this probably on Colorado polls or just with your friends over beers about like the horse race coverage or the process story, right? You want the journalists to get to what happened and not like how it's happening, because that's just easy. You don't want to see a story so-and-so and so-and-so are in different lanes, and this is what political consultants say about what they need to do and what their strategy should be to win.
Sure.
Well, okay, I'm a reader. What does that tell me about whether I should vote for that person or not? There's not a single policy mentioned. And so the goal was to do that. To what extent did they do it? I had a panel about this that I put on with from my position as being on the board of Society of Professional Journalists. We do like one public engagement a month, and we had a panel at CoLab with the handful of the newsrooms who did that, and it was pretty cool to sit there and listen to like how they think they took that to heart and changed their coverage. And so I would say, like, as long as more people are at least thinking about that and acknowledging that we don't have to do political coverage like we always did is a good thing. And then we can hold them accountable for if they go back to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with that, though, I think, is that, as we look at data from the 2024 election, it's not clear to me how much issues even really matter that much to voters anymore, which makes it hard to figure out, do voters really want to know what the two candidates for Congress in, say, Congressional District 8 up in Adams-Weld County, do they want to know what they each think about Ukraine? Do they care? I don't know.
In my opinion, probably a lot less than 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That it's just what really matters is there's an R or a D.
Yeah.
It's the person that I am, for whatever reason, devoted to ideologically and politically, endorse that person or not. But how about this? So you're involved in politics, right? So we had all these ballot measures. There was a ton of advertising for those. Like think of like the Kent Theory one, right? The ballot measure that would have completely just scrambled how we
open primary, open.
How much money did they put on television or direct mail or on the radio or whatever? And that failed. Why do you think? Do you think it was because people were persuaded by the opposition to it? Or do you think it was people who actually got the ballot, were interested, and Googled it and read local news coverage of it in the lead up to casting their ballots in the lead up to the election?
I think in general it failed because people didn't understand it. And I don't know if that was the fault of the advertising, or whether that was the stories they were reading about it didn't clarify it well for them, although I don't think that's probably the case. I think it just failed. It was complicated and it was hard, in fairness to them, it was a hard thing to message.
And I think that's what I've heard them say. Right? Sometimes a ballot measure will fail, and maybe not on the record, but people behind it will like privately like grumble about the media coverage about it. Like, oh, we never got a fair shake in the media or something like that. And the reason I asked that is because I don't think I'd seen that critique from those folks. And I just kind of wonder, like, that'd be a good like grad school, someone's PhD study or something like that. Like if you could find out to what extent, the electorate like took into account the news coverage on that and then, decided we don't like this but yeah, I've heard that too. I think it was the confusion angle that like they took on it. Like, oh, it was complicated. So we'll try it. We'll try to dumb it down next time, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's a hard thing to explain in 15 seconds. And the way things are today, if you can't do it in 15 seconds, you lost people.
Well, what did you think of the coverage? You've been here. You like pay closer attention to politics probably than I do. What are changes that you're seeing, or how did you assess? What grade would you give the media in Colorado last time?
I actually felt like the media did a worse job than they've done in recent years, particularly in the 8th Congressional District. That was the one race we had in Colorado that was very close, very, kind of a 50-50 district. The outcome had, played a role in who was in the majority in Congress. And by and large, there just wasn't a lot of coverage about it, I thought. I think there were some reasons that you can point to. Yadira Caraveo, the Democratic incumbent, didn't do a lot of outreach, wasn't available a lot for reporters. Maybe that had something to do with it. But I thought in general there was, I noticed more of like on issue X, Gabe Evans says, I agree. And then that was it. Like no like digging into whether that was accurate or whether that made sense, or that was sort of my take there.
So I could have, you could have pitched this to me. Like I didn't actually look at the coverage of that race. And I've done that in the past where I've just taken a particular race and kind of read as much coverage as I can and then assessed it. You know what? One thing that's fascinated me that I have written about in my newsletter, I'm not the only one. Some national organizations, CJR did something about this, was Boebert. Not this time, but actually like the first and second time. I thought that she that she confounded the media twice in Colorado. When I say the media, I mean the political press corps twice. Once when elected, and the reason how you can tell this is when you see in news coverage that it was a stunning result. If the reporter's writing it's a stunning result, who did it stun? The reporter, not the majority of the electorate that voted for that person, right?
Although the primary election when she was first elected, that was a stunner. I mean, that was because nobody knew who she was.
A stunner to who?
I suppose that, anybody who had been paying attention.
That primary election, it wasn't stunning to them.
That's true, but to the people
it was stunning to the political consultants who weren't taking it seriously,
or the people who didn't vote,
who didn't do
primary.
Enough, robust reporting to get their finger on the pulse of the electorate, right?
Well, and it was stunning to me, being someone who doesn't live in the district and wouldn't have voted in that primary anyway. So, I didn't have a sense.
But I don't think it should have been. So I think if there was really robust reporting on that election, then you wouldn't have been stunned. You would have found at least one report that was like, oh, wow. Like I remember, I think John Frank did this for the Denver Post in like 2016. He did a piece about Pueblo, and it was like, if Pueblo flips, then Donald Trump probably wins or something like that. And he interviewed a whole bunch of people in Pueblo. And I read that story and was like, after reading that, like, I wouldn't be surprised if Pueblo goes red. Mm-hmm. And so when it happened, like, there I'm not surprised. So that's somebody who goes and spends time there, does research, talks to enough people. And so that clearly didn't happen. And also for just like, it was the pandemic and a lot of reporters weren't out there. Were especially like Denver-based reporters, they just weren't leaving their homes because, and this candidate was out there.
Right. In general, I just thought we got in this last cycle too much of the candidate X says this, candidate Y says that.
Well, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry to
End of the story.
Because that's then if it was by those news organizations that had kind of committed to not doing that kind of coverage, then I would say that that's disappointing.
One of the bigger news media stories in 2024 was about the Colorado Republican Party removing Sandra Fish of the Colorado Sun from its state convention. I don't remember that kind of thing happening in the recent past. What was your reaction to that? And is that something we need to expect now?
Totally. Yeah. I think it's performative. The object, I can't speak for the Republican Party, but as like somebody who follows politics, my kind of take on that was that the act itself of like removing that journalist from there, they weren't going to get much out of that than they were the broader backlash to it and the like they can fundraise off of that, and interestingly, so can the Colorado Sun. And so, were they just annoyed at her coverage? Like, yeah, I bet they were. They couldn't find anything factually incorrect with it as far as I understand. But like, that's the you just look at politics now, like that's the climate we're in, where you do something like that and it blows up nationally, and like, that's actually good. That negative attention is actually good for
that's true
the base and stuff. And so, but I sought to find out if, I found out how much money the Colorado Sun had taken in when that happened, and it was like thousands of dollars. And the treasurer of the Republican Party told me that, like, yeah, we got some, contributions, but it was also like our assembly weekend. So so they couldn't really tell, but weren't like willing to come out and say, yeah, we raked it in, after doing that. But who is that going to turn off? Who's already like at that convention, or who already is, planning to vote for a political candidate who's like constantly trashing the media and saying that, get him out of here or whatever. So like, yes, I think we're going to see more of that. And I think, we'll watch and see how many, like, who winds up being in the press corps at the White House at those briefings. I think they're going to shake that up. So I think it was kind of presaging what we'll see happen at the national level.
Well, we had another weird thing that happened on election night that I'd never seen before, that I remember anyway. Republican Jeff Hurd's campaign in the Western Slope kept reporters inside of a makeshift room at his election night party. And I thought,
escorts, they had escorts if they wanted to go to the
right.
bathroom.
And then he had the temerity to come into the room and say, I want to be really transparent as a member of Congress. It's a weird start.
Yeah. So I think there's two options here. And I wrote about this, and like, all right, they didn't want to talk to me about it. So I don't know what their take on it is. And as far as I know, since then, that candidate or anyone around them, I've not seen them publicly respond to this and explain.
No.
Like whether it's apology of like, oh man, I'm a new candidate. I didn't know, I wasn't used to this, or blame it on a staffer.
Right.
Like, nothing.
I thought the rogue staffer would get thrown under the bus. Yeah.
Like didn't address it as far as I know. And I reached out. I didn't hear back. And like, so my kind of take on that was, either this is like the kind of Trump thing. That's what Trump used to do at his rallies, was put I'd been to a few, was put the press in a pen. It was usually like bike racks or like a metal pen, and you weren't allowed to leave. And if you left, you couldn't come back. So like, that's not new. It was new at the local level. Like that was new back in 2015 and 2016. Like that was strange. I'd never been in a situation where the political handlers who know you because they're
Right.
like the local advanced people are like, hey, listen, here's how this is going to work. We're going to walk you here.
Right.
Stand here and you can't leave. And if you leave, you can't come back. So like when I read that, I was kind of like, okay, that sounds Trumpy. And I think people were surprised because that particular candidate like wasn't like as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but is not like
Nobody's been bashing him or anything.
And so, it could be that, or it could be like new candidate. It was an advanced staffer's idea or something like that. And I wish I was there because like, didn't the reporters like complain at the time?
Well, I wouldn't have stayed in there.
Days later, until Charles Ashby wrote that column in the Grand Junction, and I was like, why are we hearing about it from him and he wasn't even there?
I wouldn't have listened to them, and I don't. But I wondered, do they have the media in a tough spot where, the media could say, look, then we're not going to give you any coverage at all.
They don't care.
But maybe that's what they want, right?
Yeah. No, so politicians for like, I guess over a decade now, have figured out that they can leapfrog the traditional media in ways that they just were not able to in the early 2000s and before that. And they started learning this in around, well, I'd say like 2006-ish, 2008. And then it got worse in 2012. I think 2012 we could look at as the first Twitter election. Mm-hmm. And there's Peter Hamby wrote a great study for Harvard on this. It's called Did Twitter Kill the Boys on the Bus? And it's just a really great analysis of the Romney campaign and how they were responding to the new atmosphere where the reporters who were on the bus are also tweeting in real time. And then if you look at the next election, I think, I'd heard that called the Snapchat election.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this one was going to be the AI election. And I don't actually think we got through it without.
Yeah, I don't think that happened.
Yeah, I think we got through it without. Well, this could be scary. We either got through it without like the big neutron.
We didn't know.
We don't know.
Right.
And so, I think that the certain candidates, like the ones who are benefiting politically from trying to discredit the credible press, know that they need, local press, for instance, to some extent, but that they can like get more national attention by marginalizing the press or antagonizing the press. They kind of get more benefit from that than they might a story because they have their own media now and they have their own ways of, and because of media is so fragmented and people are just kind of reading what they want, not to have an open mind and maybe learn something new. So the relationship, I think, between the press and politicians is definitely different than it was 5-10 years ago.
I want to ask you about something we talked about with Kyle Clark of 9 News on this show last year. He was really lamenting the reluctance of news outlets to report on extremism and anti-democratic efforts, because I think some newsrooms or reporters will say they don't want to take a side. I think Kyle's point was the side is democracy. We should all be on that side. What's your take on that?
I don't think it's gotten any better in that year that you had that conversation with Kyle. I've not seen a demonstrable difference since.
Do you think there should be?
He's out there on his own. Yes, I think he's out there on his own on local television. And you can just see how he stands apart from everybody else because, and it's not, and people are going to like hear this and be like, well, that's because he's the only one who's willing to have an opinion. And like, is that true?
Yeah,
like,
right.
Didn't there used to be a perspective where they would like, it would say on the bottom perspective, and like the news person would say, here's my take on the facts you just saw. And people like, what I think is interesting is when you hear some people complain about some of the things that he's doing specifically, you might hear somebody say, we need to go back to the days of Walter Cronkite. We need to go back to the days of Edward R. Murrow.
And they forget that that's what they did.
That's why the awards are named after
right.
Kyle Clark win them.
Right.
You know, I'm gonna tell you something that's really gonna blow your mind because like you've never thought of this before. But do you ever notice that people like seem to not like something if they disagree with it? I mean, that's it. If he says his commentary and the person agrees with it, they post on Twitter, "Oh wow, look at that!"
Right.
He really went after, like, I'm surprised. But the next day when he goes on and issues a commentary that same person might not like, it's, we don't need your opinion. Just give us the facts and give us the news, you know? So.
And news to me has always been opinion.
At that criticism. But yeah, he gives a great public talk. If you ever seen him, I don't know if he said this on the air, but he makes the analogy to wildfires. He says, if there's a wildfire coming towards your community, it's a news anchor's job to go on TV and point it out and say that wildfire is coming our way. It's okay. I'm quoting Kyle now. It's okay to be anti-wildfire.
Right.
And it's okay to be pro-democracy or something like that.
Right. And to me, the best journalism has always been the journalism that says, we looked at this side, we looked at this angle, and this seems strange, or this seems good, or, the context matters.
Yeah, sure it does. Yep. And so just to give you the short answer to that, yeah, I think I would like to see more news organizations be willing to do that. I'd love to hear from them why they aren't and why they don't. Because I've heard his competitors, I've heard like people who, at least one person who runs a competing newsroom say like they like what he's doing.
Why do you think it's not done more then?
I don't know. I think in my opinion, and like I'm not as plugged into the local TV broadcast scene as I am in parts of the media. It's just not my background. But as someone who's like followed the media and like just knowing some journalists and how newsrooms work, I think a lot of it is like we've always done it this way.
Right.
And also I think some of it is it's easy, and TV to some extent, because for like just out of its history, has been kind of more vanilla.
Yeah.
And not wanting to be all that different. And that's why I think if you watch like the format of 4 different TV stations a night and you're just switching through them, they might not be all that different.
Yeah, it's still news, weather, sports.
And we've got this model. Yeah. Why do we want to mess with it?
Right. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for taking so much of your day here to talk with us. What is the best way for our listeners to follow you and your work?
Well, thanks. Go to coloradomedia.substack.com and you can sign up for the newsletter. And every week you'll get reporting and commentary and analysis, kind of similar to the stuff that we talked about. And it's original reporting. I try to do an original piece of reporting every week, or at least bring something original to an item. I do a mix of original reporting and aggregation. And it's kind of like the one place where I do the job. I do the work for you. If you're interested in what's going on behind the scenes in Colorado media, I'm going to find out everything that's notable that's going on in the media scene in our state each week. And obviously I'll miss some things. And if I do, send me them as tips. And it's like a good roundup at the end of little tidbits of stuff, and then some more deeper items. And
I read it every week.
Yeah,
everyone should.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I named you in last week's newsletter because you had a great quote about, or maybe it's 2 weeks ago when you changed your website, something about 1995 called, and was that you?
Uh,
Why you changed your website?
I don't know. I don't think that was me, but it was a good quote. Let's attribute it to me.
Find out if I have to issue a correction. Colorado Media. That was about the Colorado Poll site.
I will go back and check as soon as we're done here.
Well, thanks for being interested in it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you taking some time, Corey, and we'll have you back soon.
Cool. All right. Take care.
Thanks.